Welcome, everybody. I'm Merle Robinson, and I'm your lead speaker for this presentation. I also have with me Paul Horwath. I hope I pronounced that right, Paul. And helps if I turn off the YouTube channel and make sure we broadcast. Okay. So to start off, I want to say this is part of Connection Online 2021's extended events that we're conducting in association with the Armchair Dragoons, and want to thank them incredibly for all the help. This particular presentation has to do with megagaming in the hobby environment, and in particular, what I'm going to try to do in this presentation with my partner is talk to you about where we're going with this in the United States and Canada, what kinds of interesting things it's led to, and how it may apply in some ways to our professional development and building that stable of experts to help do professional games. So the next thing I'm going to do is flip the slides. So I'm Merle Robinson. I'm a retired DoD civilian analyst. I'm a Lean Six Sigma black belt. I'm the lead designer for the National Security Decision-Making game. We did a presentation on that yesterday. I also have a Moore's Wargaming certificate, and I'm the outreach director for both Connections Online and Connections USA, because we have this nice little Venn diagram of people that are co-conspirators for one or the other. And with me, I have Paul Howarth. Am I saying that right? Okay. And this is a fortuitous event because we stumbled across one another at this convention, and I've been studying some of his stuff. So I said, why don't you come and talk about it in person? So he's going to join us there. And if you want to talk about your background so people have a better sense of what you've done in the UK.
So yes, my background is I'm education trained. I trained for middle school. I was going to join the military, and having spent time in Africa, I spent time with the military and I spent time working in schools and came back and trained as a middle school teacher. I then worked in sports development. My degree is in theology, so this really isn't relating to wargaming at the minute. But then I went and spent 10 years in secondary education where I'd always been a gamer. I'll talk a bit more about my gaming background later, but I'm currently an active reservist with the UK military in outreach / what we call civil affairs. And I founded Penang Megagames, and I run Story Living Games.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, just for those people that don't know, NDMG is a live action role play game where we have up to 127 people in our largest game historically, but we can accommodate more. And we're basically an unstructured live action role play game with some attributes that have great similarity to the more structured version of what we're going to talk about today. The kinds of things that we do in my group, I just want to promote for a second. We do games of varying length and varying levels of fidelity to reality, including some science fiction games, but our core is devoted to studying international decision-making, and we do a lot of related lectures with things we learned along the way. We show up at lots of places, and we've done academic events as well as conventions. We generally show up at 3 hobby conventions every year in the United States: Origins, Gen Con, and Dragon Con. And we've done professional events at National Defense University and from the Marine Corps Intelligence Activity, and for WINSEC, which is down at Fort Benning, where we had a wonderful Cuban Missile Crisis game with a bunch of Latin American officers. So just if you have more interest in that, ping us at our Facebook page or send me a note here through Discord. So this particular presentation sort of talks about the mega story of Wargame Evolution. I mean, we always talk about how it started with H.G. Wells and with the folks in Germany building the Kriegspiels. But this is a live action version of those kinds of events. And there are a number of similar formats, and we'll talk about those as we come along. My theory on this thing is basically what's happened is in the UK, shortly after the Second World War, we had a cadre of people, and many of them had their second generation apprenticeships or apprentices get involved in the late 80s, early 90s with this concept of mega games. It's people that came from disparate backgrounds, whether it was education or military and role playing, and they brought those pieces together to generate what we now are calling a mega game. And there are some key differences between the mainstream description of Megagame and what NSDM does, because we try to focus on real world events, historical, contemporary, and sometimes future events in terms of if there's a technological trend or development. These folks primarily are focused on fantasy and science fiction themes. You know, a mega game in their definition is for groups of upward of 20 people to 30 or 50, and sometimes as many as 300, okay, where they have competition and cooperation in a fictitious scenario normally. Some of them are historical because they have things like a war of the successors after the death of Alexander. There are games about that. Gameplay is usually open-ended without predetermined outcomes, but there's a structure. Sometimes they're flexible because they have adjudication by a control team, just like a professional live-action role play or political event, PMISI kind of study that you might do in a professional environment. And basically what I've seen is experience leads to development and innovation. And, you know, it took them about 40 years before this crossed the pond to the continental United States and Canada. It started with a tradition of, originally, I think this group was called Chestnut Lodge War Games Group in southern London. And they started building games using these models and advanced progressively. And we'll talk about some of those in a little bit. And that's where Paul in particular will jump in. Now, when I did social analysis, I pretty much figured that Jim Wallman is sort of the nexus of this. And he was heavily involved in some of the early events in America and Canada that helped bring it across. So I want to let Paul talk about that for a second.
So Shut Up and Sit Down was sort of the most famous mega game. Up until then, the vast majority in London had been historical games at that point, because Megagamemakers is primarily composed of people, or Chestnut Lodge, primarily focused on people who actually have a deep interest in history and understanding why things have happened. There were occasional side forays in other areas, but for most of its time, it grew out of a war games club. And actually, Chestnut Lodge War Games Group is still going. You can find them, quick Google. They're on Facebook as well. So I hope that might come in lieu of subs to anyone who's interested, because I haven't paid for the last year. But yeah, it's still an active group that they meet regularly, and they play test their games. They play other games that aren't necessarily mega games, but which might be of interest and might inform future games as well. But the Shut Up and Sit Down board game vlog was, I think it was a small game. It was only about 30 people, but someone suggested that they should come down. To be honest, I don't know off the top of my head. I wasn't in London that day. But it was the first game, I think, that had gone viral around the world, partly because it was a really engaging topic for lots of people who liked board games, but also because Shut Up and Sit Down had a big following. And they were very good at editing it together and putting together a coherent narrative. They'd got a captive audience who were waiting for their next update, and they managed to tell that story during the course of it as well, which really sold people on it.
The other thing I think I perceived as I was doing research on this, on the origins over in the UK, was that most of the people that were involved were avid history buffs. They were professionals of one kind or another, and they took a professional approach to their gaming. So that added to a lot of the flavor. And some of the most early games were actually campaign games, like refighting the advance across Belgium in World War II. So they started with a tilt towards historical campaign games, and then started evolving and tapping the creativity of different people in the group to branch out to more and more fantastic topics, where today, at least in North America, we think of it as fantasy and science fiction topics, which is what's caught on with the college crowd. And we'll talk about that some more in a little bit. So here are a few examples. One of the big producers of things are the Megagamemakers folks. And I'll point out a couple of things and I'll pass it to Paul. You know, this shows the breadth of creativity in what they were doing. They've got a Washington Conference game. They've got Chinese warlords. They've got sort of a Call of Cthulhu Unspeakable Horrors game. There's a Shogun type game. You know, there's Cold War Gone Hot kinds of games. And I'll let Paul pick it up from here.
Well, what I think is quite interesting is I only recently found out about reacting to the past in American universities in the last few years. And when I look at some of the topics here and compare them to some of the ones in the Reacting to the Past library, there's a lot of overlap. So I know there's something very similar to Washington Conference. There's a Congress of Vienna game. Brian Cameron wrote the Dancing Congress. And there's, because they're both quite roleplay, there's probably fewer speeches maybe. There's more deal making maybe in, say, Washington Conference. compared to reacting to the past, but they're still very pivotal moments, and the consequences can be felt a long time afterwards with these key events. And also it helps as often there's a lot of research already there that you can sort of dig into, both from the academic perspective, but also popular culture as well. Quite a few of these, so Call of Cthulhu does tap in. I think on the fantasy sci-fi side of things, I think it's probably fair to say, I know Dave's listening, so he can always correct me, but I think it's fair to say that Jim in particular, embraces all sorts of topics in his games, and is probably the most open in terms of historical and the science fiction and the fantasy. And because he's produced so many games, then it was able to develop and capture other people's interest, which, as you say, then as it spread around the rest of the UK, Europe, around the world, lots of people interested in fantasy and science fiction in particular really embraced this because it tied in with the huge rise in popularity in board games, but also the enduring popularity of role-playing, whether it's online or around a tabletop. And people can see the best of both worlds. So, yes.
So I'd also like to point out, Dave's kind enough to join us in the chat channel, and he pointed out that one of the key events, and we're going to talk about a bit more, was the videos put together by the game reviewers, the Stand Up and Shut Up and Sit Down group, that played a Watch the Skies game, which is an Alien First Contact game that came over. And basically, they were so excited about it, they raved about it in their video, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But thank you, Dave, for that addition. So just trying to ensure that you get a sense of the depth of things. This, I think, is Jim Wallman's private company. And you'll notice one of the things I think is really interesting is they've got a game called Condition X-Ray, which is how you deal with ship damage control. Does that sound like the kind of thing our professional gamers would do? Yes, it does. They've got a couple of others, like there's Henchman, which is totalitarian infighting. There's Supplying War. I mean, they cover so many things. But the things that really started getting attention in the U.S. initially was Watch the Skies, which we'll talk more about, and A New World Order. Do you want to make any other comments there, Paul?
No. That seems fine.
Okay. So, here's a couple examples. One is Funeral Games, which is after the death of Alexander. And you can see how the board is set up and the legend and how they have tactile components, because we'll talk a little bit more in a bit. But every mega game that basically is using this format has some kind of tactile counters that are oversized or figures. They have very vivid maps. They have cards for certain inserts or scenario changes. They have certain markers to indicate key decisions that have been made, whether they're alliances between players or player groups. All of those things are a component of the picture. So this is the Washington Naval Conference, and I'm going to let Paul talk to this because he's a lot more familiar with it.
Well, to be fair, I've not actually played Washington Conference. Sadly, I was unavailable when Dave last ran it. But again, I'm sure Dave will correct me where I'm wrong. As I was explaining to Mill before we started, I think the real depth from Washington Naval Conference and the fact that last time he ran it, Dave was able to run it on his own. And I think pretty much he just made sure people arrived and had their briefings in time. There's absolutely immense amounts of research, not just for the team and for their objectives, but also the biographies of the characters. So you have a named character, which really immerses people in that. There's a press team in there, and obviously things going in the press, agreements being made, that creates more tension for players. But I think that there is a real mix between some games where it's about a role. So if you're playing Watch the Skies, you could be a president, you could be the scientist, you could be the diplomat, you could be the head of the armed forces, but it's not necessarily a named character, partly because it's fantastical, but also then anyone can play those characters. Whereas in Washington Naval Conference, regardless of who you are, what you look like, you're playing the character. There's a picture of your character in your briefing. That is who you are, because part of today's vision is you really understanding who that person is, what motivates and drives them, and therefore that's more important than being able to roll dice and things like that. You need to know who you are and what your non-negotiables are, and I was going to talk about the non-negotiable aspect later. Also, there is a point there about it. It's available for download. It is on the Megagamemakers website and also on Dave's personal website. It is available for people to download the handbook and see how that plays. If you want to play it, Dave does recommend that you just read the handbook, because the other elements there are more important, particularly if you're reading other people's briefings. It is available to download and play, but Dave does request it's for non-profit, and ideally, if you could make a donation to charity, that would be much appreciated. So thank you very much.
I just put that link up, and although they can't click on it here, it is in the Discord chat.
There we go. I hope that's okay, Dave.
I think we may have covered it, but the thing that's also interesting here, and we'll come back to, what Megagames have as a real strength for organizing large groups of people is the number of roles required for facilitators and staff are very limited. Part of the reason that goes on, and I'll talk more about that later, is for the most part, unless you've got a game where you're role-playing individuals as opposed to groups and teams, the number of decisions people are given are very limited and structured. So there's a clear difference in what they get to do. So common Megagame elements are, it's interactive storytelling, it's unscored, and it tends to be a lot like role-playing in video games in some ways, because it's a visceral experience where people have, on-site meals sometimes and party favors and treats, because people will get out t-shirts, so they'll have a fee for pizza. It's a community event, and it's as social as it is tribal, as it is thought-provoking, because most of the time they focus on the decisions that the participants are involved in. So there are colorful maps, there are miniatures or counters, there's post-game videos, there are people doing their blogs and their private posts from the games, and it makes it really exciting, particularly for the young folks. So common things to the structure is they often have turns with phases. They have team time where you'll get people together, and generally speaking, you might have a team and every team looks the same. That isn't totally true in all cases, but you might have a president, you might have a defense leader, you might have a foreign minister, you might have 4 or 5 other roles, and each one of those people is more or less identical in their basic capabilities from cell to cell, whether it's a nation cell or tribal team or whatever. So when they start the game, they sit in a group of 6, 7, 8 people and make their strategy, and then they all go off to do actions related to the area of expertise they have, and they wind up in other small groups. So for example, one common model is you'll have 49 players in 7 groups of 7. Well, so what that does is they all are nobody's in a section that's with more than 7 people. And they have 3 or 4 choices of things they can do on the kinds of deals that they make often, but not always, okay? And therefore, the outputs of that are what get reflected on the major maps or the status boards or whatever tools are being used. There are also some kinds of instances where there are interrupts and sub-games and things like that. But for the most part, there are decision stovepipes, which make it very easy to adjudicate. So if you've got 7 cells, you need maybe 2 or 3 adjudicators to basically play for fairness between the cells that are meeting simultaneously. You need one person to do the master control map, one person to be a game director, and one person maybe to watch for people who are in trouble. That's the kind of stuff that means you could run many of these games with 4, 5, or 6 staff. And in the case of Washington Conference, our understanding is they run it at least once with 1 staff. So this is a remarkable achievement, because most professional games, you've got a cast of dozens. The other thing is all those interactions are recorded in a central place so that people get periodic postings. Sometimes they'll use projector screens, sometimes they'll use status boards, but it's all the same kind of concept. There's generally a limited number of variable roles, but some people get really creative. We'll talk about Den of Wolves in a little bit, and they've personalized it and diversified it a little. So there's core roles, and then there's sort of ancillary roles. They tend to have very minimal rules. Each player has a page or 2 of a rule set for the things that are specific to them. And there's maybe 5 or 6 pages about the game as a whole, because most of the game write-ups are for the operators of the game. So if you download the package of Den of Wolves, you shouldn't be reading all of it. You should, if you're going to play it, you should be reading just a couple of pages. and it basically is an engaging experiential focus. I mean, it's designed to tap all of the kids' senses: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, visceral, everything. And that's one of the things I point out, and I don't want to overstress kids, but I mean, these are young, well-educated college people who have been role-playing since they were little, and they have taken their creativity and translated it into the games. That's one of the things that generally in the professional world we have beaten out of us, because there are common approaches and standard ways you do it and certain things that are acceptable for analytical or research games. But the essence is this is tapping a whole new group of people with excitement and enthusiasm, which are just what we need for the next generation of professional gamers. Oh, what a novel thought. We'll come back to that. So, the other thing that happened here was this stuff migrated to America. And what really made it happen was the Shut Up and Sit Down guys, who did a raving video about it because they have a lot of followers. And it started essentially in 2014 with their podcast, A Goddamn Megagame. Does that tell you how excited they were? Okay. And then it went to one of the Canadian conventions, and then it drifted, as near as I can tell, to the Wisconsin kids that crossed the border. So there's a big concentration of people in Wisconsin and Michigan who are mega gamers, but now it's drifted to California. There's a large group out there, and a lot of other kinds of associations. So as near as I could figure when I started doing this, there's at least 35 major public mega games in the USA and Canada in 2019, 2020. And there's maybe the same number that are advertised for external members, because you never know how many different groups are playing it on their own. And it services somewhere around 2,800 people in the US and 1,200 in the UK. It's remarkable how much it's caught on. So there are a couple of major groups that have Facebook pages and associations and email threads. Megagamemakers in the UK, Paul's group, which we just mentioned, Megagame Assembly, Megagame Coalition, and Megagame Society. The last three are basically hobbyists that have a common forum where they can talk about things. And they talk about the kinds of things professionals do, like how do you balance the design? And how much is real and how much is game? Because you always have that professional desire to have lots of detail, but you have to have flexibility and speed of play. So you sacrifice and simplify to move down that spectrum. Also, those of you who are here, please pay attention to the chat. There's lots of activity there showing examples. Most of the hobbyists are all into game-based learning. So, we're also seeing that concurrent trend in the UK that hopefully will cross over. And I know a few limited cases where it has professionally, where non-wargaming competition and cooperation exercises and games are used for marketing, for health education, and general college education. There are entire series of materials that are related to, but developed sort of independently from mega games on classroom exercises. And I'll do a call out to John Moser from Ashland University, who had been one of our hosts for an event. And he's now got 2 published works, one of which talks about Japan in 1941, that basically has a week-long project for the students with written materials to get them into the mindset of the roles. And at the end of the game, they talk about how they tried to convince the decision makers in Japan what decision to make in regards to war with America, war with Russia, peace, whatever. So there are outgrowths of this and dovetails where other things come in. Perhaps in the future, I'll do something else on more of the educational side in North America, but I want you to be aware that that's out there. The other thing to look for with this is the diversity of topics. That's what's really awesome in my view, because if you've got people excited, they're going to produce product. And in that group, it's just like with professionals. We all know at this point, 400 or 500 of us that come to places like Connections. Last year, we had about 480 people attend Connections USA. Out of those people, we are the select set. Okay. When we come to Connections, we have a high level of enthusiasm, commitment, and personal infection with the disease of the love of wargaming. So what that essentially means is on the curve of quality, we tend to be higher. And these people, 1 out of 100 may actually have the expertise that you could bring them into your team tomorrow. Maybe 1 in 50 has the expertise. They'll make a great student and apprentice to take them to the next level, where you could bring them in as an intern, help train them with certain kinds of college classes and private education that'll take them to the next level. And I want you all to think about that, because we always talk about the graying of this profession and how we're not as ethnically and gender diverse as we should be. So where's it going to change? It's going to change at the educational level in the colleges, and strangely enough, at hobby conventions. What a novel thought. Okay, so here's a couple examples. Story Living Games is another, and I'll let Paul talk to this a little bit.
So thanks very much for mentioning the education side of things. Just on the John Moser, I think it's published through Norton, the academic publishers. So there are lots of other books published by Norton.
My shout out, here it is.
Yeah, you've got Japan. I've got an American Revolution. I've got French Revolution game. Anyone who wants to research Megagames,
Europe on the brain.
There we go. There's so much information in those, and I've actually managed to pick them up on this side of the Atlantic as well. So I joined as a consequence of joining the Games in College Classrooms Facebook group. I found out about reacting. And I run games in schools as well. I tend to run them much younger, but in terms of thinking about the next generation, I think it's great doing work in universities, but also I'm quite keen that we get people playing when they're younger, long before then, because the ones who go to university are almost self-selecting the next phase. So I go into schools from an education perspective. There's some games here that I designed, again, to run on my own when I went into a classroom, because bearing in mind schools' budgets, generally there's a historical theme to them, but not always. So the top left there, that was Tribal Times, that was Ancient Celts. That was based on some of the ideas from Jim Wallmans' Crisis in Britannia, which worked as a mega game with a control team. I thought, I can't do that. So what are the key ideas that I want the young people to understand? The next couple of slides were from the Shattered City. I'd played Aftershock at the Connections UK conference with Rex Brynan, who delivered the game and talked us through all the thinking behind it. I really liked the idea. I'd done a game based on Minecraft, maths through Minecraft in a school. It had gone down really well in the summer term. They said, we're doing natural disasters in the autumn. Could you run a game for us? So I produced the Shattered City. Went down really well. I think the first version is bottom left, where it was all printed at home. Following on from that, you can see the top middle. It's all in full colour because I'm printing on banner vinyl, because it's pretty much indestructible, and you can go full colour, and it's quite easy to reprint and quite cheap. So that was being played during a holiday summer scheme. The bottom middle one, that was the War to End All Wars. That was a First World War one for the centenary. You can see everyone's in costume, whether it's for Second World War land girls or whether it's First World War. We didn't worry too much about it, because what they were doing was they were engaging. That was the Central Powers allocating their resources to the front. Top right, you can see that's the RAF playing Finest Hour. 4 girls from Barnsley, never played a game before. They walked in that morning, were playing the game within about 15, 20 minutes, and they were working out how to fight the Luftwaffe, who were coming up from the other side of the classroom with their resources. The game is about managing strategic and operational advantages. One of the lessons is it's about understanding that actually, once you've got the army back from Dunkirk, which included my grandfather, then actually the odds are stacked against the Germans being successful, particularly if you can avoid losing the Battle of Britain and keep the convoys coming in. So the girls there, we did a sterling job. Maybe, I've put down there, the first lesson for Megagame design for 10-year-olds. Bottom right is when I took an alternate version of the game to the Connections UK conference for the first time, and I played it with adults. That was the first time Britain lost the Battle of Britain, when we gave it to the wargamers, because the young people knew to keep on shooting down fighters as well as bombers, and actually split their forces to do so, rather than just let the RAF get shot out of the sky. But in terms of, I say design for 10-year-olds, that isn't meant as a pejorative. This is thinking we've got people coming in a very short time frame. Normally a mega game will run for the course of a day. I'll be running a game maybe for usually at least a morning, the Battle of Britain Finest Hour, that was originally designed to run 3 times in one day with 3 different classrooms. And somebody did say to me, I just want bother. And I said, well, that's what they need. There's a chance to go in and actually teach some history and develop some understanding and understand all these different things. And we talked about pilots from Eastern Europe who were fighting for the RAF. We talked about some of the issues around the quality of the aircraft. We talked about developments in the Battle of the Atlantic, all those sorts of things. And I was like, actually, it's quite a nice, concise game. The key thing is the board you can see bottom right, has pretty much all the rules you need to play the game on it for the different areas. When you play it around the table, it is different to when you've got disparate teams, because when the teams are at different tables, they've got their own advantages, and the RAF are going to Churchill saying, we need you to play this card next turn because we'll get extra fighters. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy players are going over asking for their cards to be played. Around the table, pretty much, as I say, everything's on that board other than one side of A4 briefing. But that actual board cost me probably the equivalent of about £20, including postage, from Italy, and I had it turned around within a week. So I just produced that with Microsoft Publisher, which does show for those of you from a design perspective, but it does a job, and it's quite clear, and the players can engage with it really quickly, and they don't need me constantly reassuring them or checking things because it's right in front of them. In fact, I seem to recall that the top right game was where there was a very happy member of the Kriegsmarine going around sinking convoys. She took great delight in going over with her dice and bouncing them off the table. But yeah, lots of colour, making sure that things are really clear and concise in the instructions, and actually running it past them, playtesting. It's the bottom left is a playtest game. It worked pretty much as well as the middle top one, but it's less durable. So I did amend it after the first game. You can see in that bottom left corner, the girl with the glasses. She was the mayor. She volunteered to be the mayor in the first 2 minutes. Generally, when we're running games down here, there are no, this is a boy's job, this is a girl's. Who wants to be the mayor? The mayor is just a gender-neutral role. It's a title, there's a surname. Right, what do I need to do? I'm the mayor. What do you want? And off they go. And in that photo, you can see the boy next to him, he's got his hand stretched out. He was actually the mayor's aide, and he was taking some resources to go and give directly to his friends. Corruption. And he caught this at the corner of her eye, and she went, that's not right. You're sacked. And he looked at me, and he went, can she do that, sir? And I went, well, she's the mayor. And he went, all right then. So then he lost his job, and he went and he sat with his friends and carried on working with them. But it was that rapid decision. She knew that wasn't right. This is not how we do things. And she didn't waste time. Oh, how do we handle this? No, that's not right.
And that's an important piece of when a game is going to run most successfully is the skill of your key facilitators and your game director, because you instinctively know the right and wrong of the flow. The other advantage is, particularly with younger people, but it applies with adults as well, is having simple and clear and concisely written mechanics. And I can't stress enough, this is a common theme for me. Thinking is hard work, and developing these games is hard work. For those who are also interested in some of the things being done in junior high and high school in America, you might want to look at the recent George Washington University YouTube briefing by Jared Fishman, who talks about his experience with schools in Pennsylvania and the fact that he's part of the new Historical Miniatures Gaming Society East initiative called HMGS Next Gen. So that's another video that I'd recommend to all of you to take a look at. So here's the very British Civil War, and I'll let Paul pick up on that as well.
So yeah, well, just another design lesson that I learned is thinking about the players that you've got, but also, as you talked about, the facilitators. So this was my first mega game for adults, early 2016, and I knew that not only were the vast majority of players new to mega games, this was run in Manchester. For those people who aren't aware, Very British Civil War is a tabletop miniatures background. It's set in the mid-1930s. Edward VIII doesn't abdicate. Oswald Mosley becomes Prime Minister, and there are schisms. We do know a couple of the game writers, so they have great delight in coming up with their own little backstories set around where they live. So a lot of the setting is set in the south of England because that's where they live, or the west side. So we said with Pennine Megagames, our first homegrown game will be set in the Pennines. And these were some of the key things that I wanted. One of the things to bear in mind when people are coming to Megagames, yes, they will be traveling on the day in many cases, but lots of people will make a weekend of this. And I know in the States, the US conventions, HMGS, things like that, you will be traveling for several days for the gaming. But people pay £30 on average for most Megagames in the UK. For people traveling from London and staying overnight, that's dwarfed by the cost of transport and accommodation. So people are investing not just time, but also money into this. So they want to know that they've got value for money to a degree. I think Megagamemakers, and Dave and Jerry aren't too offended, but I think one of the things is most people were living in the southeast at this point in time, could travel in, and maybe expectations in terms of, well, we'll try this, we'll engage with it, we know what we're turning up for, and we're going to see our friends because there's a pre-existing club. It's easier, whereas we had fewer opportunities. You only get one first time at a Megagame. So looking at some of the players around there, I knew that some people really enjoyed the negotiation aspect. So we had roles for people playing the political angle on the top left. The map was absolutely enormous, right in the middle of the room as people walked in. I wanted people to see a full colour map. It was a beautiful map. I'm printing that on banner vinyl. It's going to cost me £120 at the time because it was a more expensive supplier. But when people walked in, that set the scene. There was a map. It was based on a 1930s motoring map of the north of England. Brilliant, done by Daniel, who did that for us. And then other aspects. So down in the bottom, there's a tracker there for a political game. The idea was people were playing political activity tokens. The top said what they were doing, political rallies, guest speaker, or public speaker, town hall meeting or something like that. The reverse of it was played blind and had a value between 1 and 3. You played it on your colour to promote your cause in a town. You played it on somebody else's colour on the far left to actually try and drive their support down, and it was about moving it around. The good thing was, one, players really engaged with it and could also win it themselves. Two, the people running it, it was a very mechanical role. They didn't need to know about 1930s politics to run that game. They just needed to know how it worked. So a briefing the week before to cover that and the battle system, which is on the right-hand side, which has loads of prompts on it. It tells you if you're defending the hills, you can use 2 columns. That's it. If you're defending a town, you can use 3 columns. And even there would be prompts that saying, if there's no one facing this, you get a +2 for a flank attack. All the prompts were there for the players to make sure it was as intuitive as possible. I mean, it helped the fact that people were dressing up as well thematically, but it was, we had to show them, make it really transparent, lots of colour, really obvious. And I produced 2 YouTube videos in advance, one for the political game, one and one for the military game in terms of the combat sequence. Because I discovered not too far in advance that if you do a PowerPoint and you can add some sound and add some animations, with a click of the button, you can turn it into a video. So you don't even need to be filming and stopping filming the camera. You can just do it on PowerPoint, get it just the way you want, edit the comments for each slide, and then it turns into a video and upload it to YouTube. And that made life much, much easier. But part of it was around, this needs to be simple to play, even simpler to run it. And every umpire on that day who was playing the mechanical stuff had been to the briefing. And that made it so much easier. Because it was really clear. As a designer, I could say, this is how this world works. Going back to Xavier's points on Wednesday around, this is a game designer's interpretation of the world. I was able to make sure all the umpires understood this, which therefore made them far more consistent. Thank you. Yeah, you can, next slide.
So the other thing I want to make a couple points here about is, one of the other strengths of Megagames is because the mechanics are simple, and because you know what the structure of the game is exactly in advance of the game, people can sign up in advance and they know their roles and they dress up. You know, when my group goes to conventions, there's a lot of dress up and cosplay that goes on at Dragon Con, for example. But we, because we're in a public venue and we basically don't charge for tickets and it's walk-in, never know if we're going to have 60 people or 85 people or 130 people. So it's difficult to do that. But here, with that amount of preparation, even if you lose somebody at the last minute, it's 2 pages of rules that they have to read to understand their role, and they can see all the mechanics in front of them. So boom, you're right into the game. So that's a real advantage of the Mega Games, and a good part of why it's caught on amongst the amateur crowd, because it's easy to understand and easy to run.
I think that point, and I haven't really covered it, is having those assigned roles in advance. So you will normally get, they tended to be posted out. Nowadays, it tends to be emailed out to you. And then as a player in your role, you'll usually have some team objectives. You'll have your individual ones. And the idea, and it's common practice, to give people something they can achieve quite early doors. Doesn't necessarily mean you've won. We can talk about that later. But it means that you've actually got something out of the day quite early. And then there are other objectives to work towards with your teammates or with other people. So you might be in X country's team, but you might also go for meetings with the other scientists from all the others. And in some games, the scientist team becomes more important than their national team and their allegiances. And there's always that element of distrust. Operational lessons. Merle asked me if I could speak about operational games. So I've played quite a few games. My first mega game was a double blind game, Operation Goodwood at Leeds Armories. That was Jim Wallman. And that was an absolutely brilliant experience. My whole experience up till then had been tabletop, wargaming, role play, but it was always separate. So it's wargaming miniatures would tend to be tabletop or board game or role playing. What I loved was the fact that I was drawing a few lines on a laminated piece of paper, writing some orders down, moving some chips where I thought the Germans were, because we were attacking Con as the Canadian Infantry Division, and then handing them over, and someone else would go behind a screen, roll some dice, and come back and inform me. And that was really useful because you were just focused then on talking to other teams and getting for the understanding that that fog of war, that uncertainty, I'm going to make a decision and it's just going to have to be the best decision I can make right now, was a really useful lesson. And it actually came out when I did a hospital game instead in future years. But as time goes by, the double blind games, you need a control team. You need a large number of umpires who really know their stuff, because there is lag between them going behind the screen, resolving things, coming back. Yes, the teams can talk to each other and plan, but it can turn into a bit of a lag. And if you've got umpires who don't know their history, then they get asked a question and people will go, I'm not sure. And then the game starts to break. So more open map games are common. So we've got examples here. Top left and bottom left are from Rob Cooper's Not Over by Christmas, when we ran it in Sheffield, still not over by Christmas. We used an army reserve, Encliffe Hall. You can find it on the internet. They have ghost hunts there as well. It's a fantastic venue. There's banners all over the place, the standards. It's very atmospheric. But there were around about 30 players around the map. There were the next layer of command are in separate rooms on the ground floor. The high commander upstairs. There are people running around between them. It creates that friction. It creates the decision-making loop. But at the same time, when people were at the map, a lot of the time, because cards had been very popular at that point in time, players who were new to that role, who maybe someone had dropped out and they played in it, they had a deck of cards and they're trying to assemble the best hand on the fly. And we're thinking, if these are professional, particularly the Warsaw Pact players, they would know that if you take some casualties in the first turn and you're the first echelon, well, that's your job. And what we shouldn't be doing is stopping to pause to take our breath, because there's another echelon coming up behind you. And players didn't really necessarily grasp that. Similarly, top middle, we've got Case Blue there. Again, fantastic, huge maps there, lots of players. That was 1942. But again, it was the cohesion at times, or things were lagging. So we're trying to build in logistics, which is essential for the Eastern Front. But trying to layer that on top of the combat was getting a bit too much detail. And again, it's that finessing the difference between them. And finally, there's Jim's Don't Panic, Operation Sea Lion, which was the first game that we ran in Manchester in a very, very long time, in 2015. Again, great success on the day, but there's still an issue sometimes when you've got some people who know their history who can decipher what those Roman numerals are and that backslash and a number, and what does FG stand for, and the players who are gamers, who come from board game backgrounds, who are those guys ours? We lost a Panzer division for an afternoon, apparently, because one of the German players had no idea where they'd gone. And he said, at the minute, he said, I feel like a confused board gamer rather than a German commander. He said, I should know that that's Unit A, they're really good at attacking into towns. That's Unit B, they've got tanks. They're really tough, but don't send them into the town. He said, because that's what I should know in my role. So if you just go on to the next slide. One of the other issues that we've got is managing those expectations. So you'll see there, my Checkmate 38, I put on the front there, this is an operational game. I don't want people thinking they're going to be moving around individual tanks. And similarly, one of the other issues if you've got your different layers of command, it's really good to create that friction, but a lot of, particularly players who don't necessarily know their history as well, they assume that if they're in the high command, they're going to be still be able to micromanage. And in this era, this isn't. Once the dice have been rolled at the start and the tanks have rolled, then you're just going to have to let things pan out for a while and see how it goes. And somebody said after one game when they were playing the high command role, I could have brought a book today. And I went, yeah, you could actually. But that really is what that role involves. But it's about managing those expectations and either saying, this role will be doing this much on the day. Your role mainly will be in advance, and maybe you could even play remotely on the day. Which we're talking about for a couple of other games, or alternatively, people double up, you give them the chance to do other roles to reduce the player count that you need, but also to keep them busy and engaged in the game. But yeah, it's those expectations. Some people, whether it's through films, whether it's computer games, the fact that you can click on certain computer games, you know exactly the morale of that unit, their firepower, their strength. You shouldn't know that if you're Halder in Case Blue, and you should be relying on people giving you that information. And working those chains of command. You don't have the level of control that you would expect, and that's a learning process. So how do we manage that one? Next slide, please.
So before we go on, there's two things I want to highlight here. When we talk about the mega game transition where people have started running mega games in America, there are two aspects to running any kind of game like the ones we just talked about. One is understanding the mechanics and being able to manage a crowd generically, which is a simple skill set. And a lot of people who have grown up in the RPG world have developed those skill sets. So they can say, you all go here and here's the rules that apply, and that's all fine and good. But there's a spectrum as you move towards historical games with fidelity. And that's where the expertise of your staff and having people who are really invested emotionally and educationally in the experience or the period. So having people that really understand Czechoslovakian 38 being your facilitators and your staff is a critical thing to maintaining the magic circle for the players. So they're thinking about just the game and how the game works. When you make a misstep because you have a critical fact error, that affects their engagement with the game in a fundamental way. So with my group, one of the things that works really well is we have high education levels and high activity levels on understanding contemporary events when we run contemporary games. So we can do things on the fly because we know how that works, and we know some aspects of the attributes and vectors and order of magnitude of things. What you see with the college gamers and the convention gamers, they often don't have that. There are some marked exceptions, but it's important to understand that that's why this is a gateway drug, okay? Mega games are a gateway drug for people who have done simple games and role-playing games to bring them in and bring them closer to the professional world.
So, which is a lovely link into how I then decided to try and approach it when I was designing my own operational games, because I'd played in a number, I'd helped with other people with theirs, but I was thinking we must be able to play these games faster. So big miniatures games, yes, we've all played for a full weekend. We know people who've slept underneath tables to make sure the figures aren't stolen overnight. They've done those things. But it's a huge logistic undertaking. And actually, if one or two people don't provide their forces or something goes wrong, it can just bring the whole thing crashing to a halt. Or debates and arguments over the rules can just take so much time and joy out of the game. So these photos are actually from both Checkmate 38 and Hold the Line 39, which was Poland. France 1940 is going to be July this year now, I think. Sadly, we've had to postpone it a year because obviously of COVID. And I think I'm going to look at the Balkans and Greece for the 41 game. But it was about thinking, why are these players here? So first of all, I wanted as many people as possible who were interested in this era to be able to play the game. So it's great that people are willing to act as umpires, but when we set up Penine Megagames, we said we will have a mixture of games. There will be historical games, there will be the some fantasy games, science fiction games, the modern day games. We will run a mixture because that's how you grow a base, and people can try different games when they know the group and they feel comfortable. But at the same time, if people are going to do 3 or 4 games that they're less interested in as an umpire, we want to let them play. So both of those games, we had minimal umpires, or alternatively, people actually who didn't know that much about military history, but knew the very, very basic rules. And if they were really stumped, then they would call for 1 or 2 of the experienced umpires. We managed to get through 14 turns in checkmate. We got through 15 turns in 6 hours for Poland with 30 players around the maps. So as far as I was concerned, that was a good pace. We were getting through them every 20 minutes. Things that we did to actually facilitate that: 1, we made sure that we used hexes on the map. It is very common in the board games. Area movement was a consideration, but far more research, to be honest, on that. But also, hexes are quite easy for generating movement. And think about limits, because the hexes are a limited size, and so there's a limit to what you can fit in them. And I built that in there. I used a nice simple graphic work. It was Inkwell Designs. It was their worldographer, I think. And that was nice and easy to use. You look at lots of board game maps for ideas anyway, but then it was also making it fit. So expanding a city on the map necessarily to hold the requisite number of units or the fortresses or whatever. So there's a little bit of divergence, but not too much. In the middle photo there, the units themselves, they're based on cubes. I was inspired watching A Bridge Too Far when they're deciding where to put 2nd SS Panzer Division, and they pick up the big black circular Doppen, Arnhem, and it goes there and it says 2nd SS Panzer Division on it. And I was watching that and I thought, I want to run a game, and this is about the aesthetics as much as anything, I want to run a game that looks a bit like those maps that you see in the films in the background when people are moving things around with flags and whatnot, and they look like they know what they're doing. So all those units there, all the cubes, they're made out of polystyrene. They were incredibly cheap to buy pre-cut, and in that case, they've got stickers on them in their national colour. So green for the Poles, red for the Germans. The national flag's on one side. Opposite is a small square. You can see an example top right for some Czech motorised infantry. I debated NATO symbols. No, I've got hobby gamers playing this one. It's going to be enough for them to understand the chain of command, and there are consequences if they don't follow orders. That's the key lesson from this one, and I want them to understand combined arms, logistics, and actually staying in your army lane, your core lane. That's really important for me. I'm not going to worry about can they identify mechanised infantry from motorised at this stage. And each of those cubes has 4 postures. On each side has a sticker. One of them is a prepared assault. The prepared assault has a small thing that tells you how many dice you roll for attack, how many hits to incapacitate you. There's no hex on the side, so you know that you can't move in a prepared attack of your infantry. You just take the ground. You turn it, you spend command points, you can turn it into movement mode. Movement mode tells you how many dice you roll to attack. You're easy to destroy or disrupt. There's a disrupt one. Movement mode has a hex on it with the number telling you how many hexes you can move, or how many hit movement points you've got. And similarly, disrupted has another, doesn't have the movement, but it does have what you need to roll to reform your unit and have it as a cohesive fighting force. And then the other one is prepared defense. And the players were just spending command points, or staff points I call them, to either change the posture of their units. You don't need to look at a map to know how many dice you roll, because it tells you on, if you've got 3 units together, you can very quickly add up 3 numbers and that tells you how many dice you roll. If you start using your artillery, the colour of your artillery units tells you which dice you roll when you use them. You spend an extra command point to use the artillery. It was that. Air support was exactly the same mechanic. And the air game was, I think this is another lesson from Megagame design, is steal things from wherever you can. So the system down here on the bottom left, sorry, be inspired by great ideas of others. So the bottom left down there, that's actually it's showing the fatigue of units as they take casualties, and you're moving them down there. Where you're allocating them, okay, that was the whole north and south. It was a bit too complicated. I'd separate it out in future, like I did for Checkmate. But actually, that worked really well, and it was based on an idea I had for tracking nurse fatigue in a hospital simulation, where people, at what point do you draw them out the line so they become back to fresh? And if you leave them in the front line too long, then they go into the dice off to see whether they're destroyed or not. And very quickly, people suddenly realise you have to start husbanding your resources quickly. Finally, the bottom right, the dice, either they're blank, they have a star on, or a tick. Ticks and stars are both successes. Stars are critical successes and are the things that kill units. If you get more, it was basically one dice roll. It's two opposed dice rolls, one against the other. You find out whether you've had more successes, you're victorious, then you find out the cost, and then you count the number of casualties, the number of stars. So you can have a very heavy victory. You can have a Pyrrhic victory in effect, but you still can force the enemy back by taking lots of casualties. It does happen. But what I didn't want was lots of saving throws, lots and lots of modifiers. Roll this number of dice, compare the two, and that was based on my brother's Judge Dredd themed game, where he just wanted one set of dice rolls to determine victory and the costs of it as well, and it worked really well, so I stole that. Thanks for that.
So I'll also point out that one of our NSDM mottos is steal from the best, then steal from the rest. And what you've done here with your tactile tools with those foam dice is a technique I think is really good, because it makes a tactile and visceral element for the players to immediately understand what's going on. In fact, I think I'll probably steal that for a couple of things in the future, because it's a really good way of making it instantly apparent to people what's going on.
I would also say, actually, we do have hidden movement, so we do have line counters moving around, and then there are rules for that, for those people who think everything is visible. But also, we didn't want to put too much in there, because it would just get in the way. It's enough that they realise they can't do everything they want every turn. That if you want to have a good attack, you're going to have to spend a turn preparing the attack for everyone before everyone goes in together. But they need to think a turn or two ahead, and then the next layer up is planning 2 or 3 turns. But when you're playing 15 turns, it's worth doing. If you've only got 4 or 5 turns to get through in a day, then people just want to start rolling dice and killing things. And then thinking about making accessibility for non-gamers. So we talked about the non-war gamers playing the military games, which we've been quite successful at, I think. Pennine Megagames, we've managed to keep that level of interest in the military games. But really think about the non-gamers. So the top left here was the Shattered City. It's about using the PowerPoint. So I was running that game in a school in a holiday program. The guy there running the activity is just a member of staff. He's one of the youth workers within the school. Because I was using the PowerPoint and clicking through each turn, right, we're in this phase now. Make sure you've got everything on your list here. If you've done it all, we'll go on to the next phase. So he was just able to support the students, work with them. And if they had initial queries, I had a chat with them all beforehand and said, look, as long as it's not going to break the game, just go with it. Say yes or roll the dice with them, if it seems reasonable, because they're engaging with this world. So it's about making sure that the players and the umpires know this is how this world works, according to my vision as a designer.
The other thing that I think is important here is, in Megagames, I see it less in the US, but in our games, we always do a debrief. And the debrief is to talk about where we've reached fidelity with reality for the purposes of fun, and where a decision could be a judgment call and you flip a coin, because it helps the players understand the consequences of their decision and the different kinds of variables that can affect it. Most often, in an unstructured game like ours, they don't know what all the factors are. Where in many mega games, just like in many board games, there's that 100% eagle-eye view where you understand everything that wasn't apparent to the real commanders. So you have to realize that, you know, you can play for fun, you can play for understanding, you can play for insight, but you're not going to say that's the result. Just as we talk about in our professional circles, games don't prove anything. But what it does is it gets people to think.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, the debrief is a key part of Megagames in the UK as well. Partly for people to tell their stories, but also to get some feedback as well as the feedback forms. One of the things that I've done quite a lot, when I say I'm talking about stealing, it's about using mechanics and other game ideas that people are really familiar with. So, for instance, the top right, I was watching curling when I wanted a trading game for my Romans system, where people were trying to get, they needed a glitter, blue and green glitter, to decorate their buildings in Constantinople according to their colours. So they were flicking counters. There's a slightly similar version in the middle where I was doing a Machiavelli game based on the Avalon Hill variant of diplomacy. The only thing I was left with by the end of writing the game was the map. Everything else was rewritten for different player interests, but that was based on Shove Hate Me. And players had the option of they could do little things to improve their chances, but a lot of it still came down to flicking counters down the board to get gold, to then go and commission artisans to produce great works of art for them. Down bottom left, that was one of my maps for North Africa, for my Romans game, and again, there's a battle board already on the map. One of the issues with every British Civil War was people took things off the map to go and fight a battle, and it slowed things down. Whereas when they did that, on every map, there was a little battle board with, again, all the prompts for them to remind them what to do. Do this, 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 and this. Units here get this. And it just speeds things up. And again, bottom right, for the very British Civil War, the finest hour, all the rules are there. People have tokens, they move them down, but they understand that actually, and it's almost unconscious initially, but they realise that most of the British pilots, or the RAF pilots, I should say, will get recovered, and the Germans don't get that as a benefit if their planes are shot down. And again, that you can bring that out during the debrief. And middle top right, that was a pandemic game which was requested by a couple for their wedding weekend. So you can blame them, I think, because that was late 2019. So that was a wedding. A couple of the people there were gamers. None of them had played a Megagame before. We had 30 people. I took my friend with me to run this one because this couple had asked us to. And everyone just engaged with it. We made it really simple. I played the Project on Nuclear Gaming, the Signal game, played it in person at KCL. I've played the online version as well. I really like the idea of signalling where you can actually carry things out. But what we did was we had different phases. So the head of state would indicate where they were going to do activity and allocate the weapon systems that are available. Then the defense chief would come along and actually carry things out. So there was so they had to talk to each other because they couldn't have perfect knowledge of what was happening. But I really like the idea of preparing things. If they're not prepared, you can't use them. So that was quite an interesting weekend because they had the wedding on the Friday afternoon, and in advance they'd said to everybody, come to us, we've got a country house for the weekend, we've got lots of food in the kitchen, stay overnight. But if you don't like gaming or board games, then you can go home on Saturday morning, that's fine. But if you're staying on Saturday, you're playing this game. And the bride had worked up a little portfolio for every player based on her knowledge of them. And they'd all got made up names pretty much from a Carry On film in some cases. But there was a little bit about them and their hobbies, and all the players could see themselves in it. At the end of that day on the Saturday, the groom said, that's been the best day of my life. At which point his wife said to him, apart from the wedding yesterday and the day that I gave birth to your son last year. And he said, it's been the best weekend of my life. But again, it was about engaging with the people who were going to be playing the game. And after a period of time, knowing what will engage them, then keeping the mechanics really simple, supporting them where they need that support. And other than that, saying to them, is there a rule that say you can't do that? No? Okay, go away. And I noticed when you were talking about your order sheets and things like that, one of the things that we had, because lots of people in Megagames, especially in the UK, people talk about wizard wheezers and these things which aren't covered by the rules. But it's really difficult to adjudicate sometimes, and people come up with ridiculous things at times, which can be a complete waste of an hour for them coming up with this idea. So we got people to write them down, what the plan was, what they would commit, as you do in your order sheets, and then maybe how long they think it's going to take them and what effect it will have. And then it gives us something to adjudicate. So we can go to them and say, well, I think it's going to take an extra turn, or there's a step missing here. What do you think that could be? And then people would go back with it. And that, well, in the army, the handrail idea, where you give people the template and they work their way through it, went down really well for the non-gamers. And then went on to use similar systems with the hospital game, which I think there's a couple of pictures of for Entrusted.
And I think you're exactly right. In our games, one of the key issues is ensuring that due to the pace and excitement of the game, because you got 100 people in a room, they're all running around crazily, trying to negotiate independent, unstructured deals with one another, you have to have a benchmark, and you have to have a decision point. And you want to be sure that you don't forget somebody because they walked up to you and thought you were going to chase them down in 10 minutes and tell them the result. The other thing I really wanted to stress with this is we talk about the migration from the UK to the North American continent. And as we talk about these college gamers and convention gamers, which includes high school kids, okay, and sometimes even younger, because we've had 9-year-olds play in our games, and 5-year-olds have specialized roles in our games for NSDM, and we can accommodate that. But the thing is, the important element is to understand that growth and the things that you can get. So in all of our games, and I think this is true with Megagames, and you can validate me or invalidate me on this, we're pretty good at telling you circumstance. We're very good at telling you choice. But the one thing we are not good at, and every time we've had a mega gamer come to us and say, how do I do this? We say, realize that whatever you're doing has a cultural base you don't control. Because if you have a real world event, historic or current, you have to do the best job you can to give a gestalt view of the mindset as you best understand it of the people involved. But Indonesians have 1,000 years of written history in 3 major languages that none of us have read because it's not in translation into English and you didn't grow up there. Chinese make decisions in different ways than Americans do. So recognize that the building blocks of understanding and insight will not be one for one. I'm sure your British games are quite different than our games in Canada and our games in the United States because of the cultural differences.
I think it varies very much on the players, because I think there are still players, regardless, there are players who like to really focus on the mechanics and sort of optimize or get optimal rolls and things like that. I think also there are players who do really enjoy the costumes and seeing their friends and spending time with them. But also, I think quite a few players who, regardless of what their briefing says, will play themselves in pretty much every game, and people are almost playing one another rather than. And it's not just Megagame. I mean, I played in an online Matrix game quite recently, and it was quite telling that people playing in certain roles were playing what they thought those people would do in those circumstances, rather just based on a very superficial understanding of it. And that was in a professional environment as well. So I think that how do you get people to understand what's important to those people and what they're not, I'm going to use that word, non-negotiables. I think there's still more work to do. How the world works is one thing. I think that is a key part of the designer's notes. But I mean, Dire Straits would be another example at Connections. I mean, there were 100 people there. It's a really frenetic. People are still trying to work out how to play the game in many cases. But the people playing China didn't get China and played like no China that I would recognize. And therefore that does make it very difficult. Or certainly the people that were coming to the map, and that's a really public place to be doing things. And so then we spoke to another umpire who was working with the teams to say, well, look, you might need to go and give them some advice here now. And usually the control in mega games are there to facilitate rather than guide players. But I think sometimes you have to go in and just have that conversation. If someone's obviously out of their depth, I mean, Justinian didn't survive the plague in my Romans game because he turned up with a Byzantine mask and a rubber duck ring. And I gave him the benefit of the doubt. We had a bit of a chat, and he was completely said, no, he's a Roman. He's not Byzantium. You need to. But he'd assured me in advance that. So I thought I'd give him the benefit of the doubt. And then when the plague hit, I said to him, right, we need to roll a dice to see whether you pull through. And he said, what do I need to roll? I said, I will tell you after you've rolled. And then he went off and he played a governor for the rest of the game and had a great, he gave really good feedback because he'd really enjoyed something that was a little bit more directed and less in the public spotlight. But again, partly that's me as a game designer and giving him that role without really understanding or checking that he understood what his role would be. So it's a two-way process. It's that dialogue. Entrusted is just here. I did share the link in the Discord channel earlier. It's on Vimeo, Entrusted Hospital Megagame. This was not quite the culmination because it's a couple of years since we've run it due to the pandemic. But this was, they're called the Health E-Research Centre, as in E-research. It is a pun, deliberate, at University of Manchester. A friend of mine, Ben, he was the confused gamer wondering where his Panzer divisions had gone, rather than actually being a German, which was, we've had some really good conversations. He's a board game designer himself, but he also works there. He's a registered nurse. And this was really good because when we were designing, I was asked to consult with him on this. He brought his boss along to one of our games. It was a military game. She was Marshal Blucher in the Jena campaign. I was really worried. I said, why didn't you bring her to the crisis management game the month before? That would have been the ideal opportunity. He said, well, she wasn't free. So she turned up as Blucher. Absolutely loved it. Even though it was semi-blind game, she said, I just love this because I'm not quite sure where the French are, but I've got to make a decision based on what I've been told. She said, and we need to do more of that in this area, in the health area, public health in particular, because we need to make decisions sooner rather than later and accept it won't be the perfect decision. She said, I want people to understand that. So we produced this game here. They did manage to put in total about £20,000 into the game, including a professional film crew to come in and do it. Everything was produced nicely, laser cut pieces. As an example of the planning for the next run, even though some of these for the first run, I said to Ben when they were making the patients up, there was a really simple system that I came up with for when to discharge patients. We had a rainbow system that was going across on a screen. Each phase, it would count down for 5 minutes. It's all on a PowerPoint slide. And the optimal time to discharge patients was when their colour matched the colour on the screen. If you discharged them early, you had to roll to see if there was going to be a negative discharge, if you're clearing the beds. If you left them in the hospital longer than they should be, then they had to stay until the next cycle, which was obviously 7 turns away, or 7 phases away, which was bed blocking. But I said to Ben, I said, when his friend was designing the layout, I said, put a dice number on there between 1 and 6. He said, why? I said, because we might need it during the game. I said, it's not in the mechanics now, but if we're printing hundreds of cards, then we need to plan ahead and think how we might use them. And we were able to use them for other things, whether it was negative discharges or if you're doing a pandemic scenario, maybe COVID carrier or something like that. But it was all about managing the flow. And what we did was nearly everyone there was not a gamer. Both runs of it, in fact. Nearly everyone there was not playing their role within the hospital. Lots of them didn't even work in a hospital. A guy from Marks and Spencer's retail shops, he'd seen it advertised on Eventbrite and just turned up. But they engaged with it. Top right, Jerry, who's on the call as well tonight. Give him a shout out because he's wearing his lurid shirt again. That's surgeons trying to get successful patient treatment tokens by playing mind puzzles and doing Boggle or Sudoku or anything like that, which basically soaked up time in a separate room. And other people were trying to clear spaces in the wards, and the surgeons were busy doing their own thing, really focused on that. And so we actually had somebody who was a doctor in real life leave on the second run because she hadn't realised it was going to be so realistic. She said, it's been really interesting, and I've enjoyed seeing it. She said, but the people playing the nurses are doing all the things that nurses do that really frustrate me in my current job. Because Ben had been a nurse, he'd been able to look at all the things that happen, the choke points, the frustrations, and having that insight was really, really valuable. I think that's the key thing. As you were saying, in terms of veracity of the game world, you need to make sure people can accept it. They might go, well, I don't think it's quite as likely as that. But if it seems reasonable, I think that's enough then for most people, because the main thing is they were learning it as they were going through it. In the second run, we had somebody who was he was playing a surgeon, He liked doing Sudoku, so he always picked Sudoku, but he was terrible at them. And all the other surgical staff were saying, stop doing Sudoku. He said, but I like doing them. But when he came back out of the room, he was going to go back in again, and there was a ward with a nurse. It was a specialist nurse on that ward due to some logos on her card. But there was only one patient. He said, right, discharge that patient. I'm taking that ward off to rest. I'm taking the nurse off to rest because we need her next turn. And they said, but this patient it's long before their discharge time. They're going to die if you take them out. He said, I've got 6 patients coming out of surgery next turn. So this nurse needs to be back on duty for at least a turn. And there's no one else available. Unfortunately, somebody else was able to say, well, look, can we transfer them onto another ward? And they had that conversation. But very quickly, he made that decision in that role. There was quite a bit of tension around it, but that was all in the space of within 3 hours of playing. People were really in character. Sorry, I'll
even if they make a bad decision, that's a learning experience, and it only needs to be approximately correct. So the other thing that I wanted to hit about the North American scene, and I'm moving up to a question here, is the North American community seems to have a lot of collaboration between the groups and their calendars. The Megagame Assembly, Megagame Coalition folks actually make a big effort for that, and they've sort of put together some guidelines for how to develop new mega games and things like that. They're not perfect, but they're a nice learning step, and they're building a culture and a community very much like we have with Connections. And I find that really great, and I want to encourage that. Also, they're really thinking about design lessons and components and the way they're going to use online media, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, whether it's blogs, whether it's posted photos. All that stuff adds to the level of enthusiasm. Now I finally got into the question, and the essence of the question was there was an observation that in the United States, that there's a tendency to go for more complex mechanisms than is the UK model, because the UK very much follows what Markowitz talks about here in the United States, is put everything in you can and then ruthlessly simplify. Because simple makes games flow. Simple makes clear to players what some of the potentials are of their decisions. So what I've seen in the United States varies, but yes, there is a tendency, especially from people who are either new or very skilled, to add more Chrome, okay? And it's not just in the physical Chrome like game components. And I think I'm saying this right, because my understanding is Den of Wolves is a US creation, which is basically a Battlestar Galactica ripoff. That's the kind of example, I think. And the answer is no, it isn't. Okay. But that's an example.
It's John Wise on in Southwest Megagames, but it has been run in the States.
But that's one I've seen run in the States, and they always want to add other pieces. There's an individual element in that. There's a media element in that. They always want to put projectors up and things like that. So there's a tendency, but I have only seen a handful live. Most of the things I know about those are secondhand. So I'll freely confess I don't have the best answer for that.
I was going to say, I think it's a combination of factors. I think a point earlier about, as we were discussing, UK and US wargaming can be quite different. So I know Black Powder tends to be more popular in the UK, where if the rules don't cover it, we'll come to an agreement, whereas US wargames rules seem to be more, apart from Wargames Research Group, obviously, tend to be more, like you say, cover everything and more precise, maybe in the language and the way conventions. So there is that difference there. I think with the mega games, there's a degree perhaps of that, but also, and Megagamemakers, anyone can shout at me afterwards, but I think in London in particular, people have been spoiled by having a very experienced team of control. People who not just know the history, but they know the rest of the team. They know they've acted as control for one another's games for decades, and therefore they have a good, and they've gone to Chestnut Lodge at the weekends and they've tried sub games, so they know how the game is supposed to work. So that gives them a massive advantage, and it is easier then to design a game which is more loose, I think would be an accurate word, where there's a lot more room for interpretation, and indeed players are okay with that. In the States in particular, but also lots of games in the UK, games are being run by people who've never even played a game, who are basing their vision on a video of one particular style of game, which was quite loose anyway. And then when you read how Jim would write the rules for the game, people will want that reassurance, I think, and maybe less uncertainty. And therefore, it does become more precise, I would say, rather than complex, because I think it can be just as complex with very loose rules when you've got all these moving parts. And actually, if it's so loose and there are lots of different agendas and different games going on, then actually the unintended consequences can be really quite bad in games at times through miscommunication. So I would say for a lot of newer games in general, people like to have some more hard and fast rules, or be quite clear from the start. This is more like a LARP mega game than a tabletop exercise mega game. And most games, I'm quite loose. I know people will debate what is a mega game. Is the number of players? Is it the topic? Is it where you've got lots of rules? I just think it's a really broad church, and there's lots of very similar games predating them, working in parallel. I picked Story Living Games for my website because it is about trying to engage and immerse characters in that world. And I just think, rather than worrying too much around whether it's a mega game or not, is it a good game for what you intend and for what the players are turning up for, is the key thing for me, really. But yes, there is a bit of a difference, but some of that is cultural, some of that is just about allowing lots of people to play the same game and get a similar experience as well. And that consistency can be really useful sometimes as well. Sometimes if you get, people don't mind a bad result if they think, well, I knew there was a good chance this wasn't going to succeed and we rolled some dice and it didn't work, that's okay. If the control player or the control umpire has just said, no, that's ridiculous, and doesn't explain it, then that creates a little bit of resentment and, oh, this isn't fair. So there's lots of things at play, I think. But yeah, there is a difference.
So I absolutely concur with you about the definition of mega games needs to be broad, because it's the skill sets that are really in common. The mechanics are sort of secondary. And I'll give you a good example of how that varies. I mean, if you talk about any particular trend that I think is dominant in the US and Canadian implementation and playing, the number of games that they play generically, they tend towards more fantastic and sci-fi topics. So they like Den of Wolves, they like Game of Thrones ripoffs, they like Battlestar Galactica ripoffs, they like Watch the Skies, all those things that are very fantastic. And when they run them, many of the crews that do it have just role play experience. So for example, I got to see a Megagame Meltdown here in America in the last 15 minutes because of control staff failures. Okay, they were running the Egon's Conquest game, which is a ripoff of Game of Thrones, and essentially the control staff misreported what a player did to another player in terms of something that happened in the past. And we had two people screaming at one another in the hall that had been lifelong friends and said, "You lied to me!" And literally, they were almost at blows in the hallway. And that was entirely the control staff's mistake, because they could have reported accurately what happened, and then it would have been a natural consequence. But they had an unnatural consequence in terms of adjudication in the game. And they could have left that for the after briefing. So there's discussion. I was role playing. This is not, me really not liking you. And it's not a personal trust issue. But that's the kind of thing that a skilled facilitation team can dodge and keep the game moving and have everybody have a good time. Because if they're not having a good time, they don't learn anything. None of the insights are something they think about and ponder after the event. So that emotional impact destroys all the other visceral things that make the game wonderful. So I'll stop my soapbox and move on there.
Well, I was just going to say on that one, I think there are good reasons why people do choose popular themes, not just because it's popular and people are interested in them, but also because people have a good understanding of how that world works, and whether they've seen the TV show or so. I'll go with inspired by rather than rip off necessarily. But to be honest, I think when people have meltdowns, it does happen. People get really frustrated occasionally, but at the same time, this is very early days, I think, for lots of these groups. People are trying lots of new things. Personally, when I run Megagames, most of the time I try and throw in at least one new idea or one new mechanic just to try it out, because it's very difficult to test them at scale, particularly with new players. And I think, again, part of it comes down to, if you've got a new team who are turning up for something that's been advertised on the internet and they are a customer rather than a member of the community, and it's different if you go into a school, the environment is that is a class or a year group or whatever, or a class or a club, but it's a community already and there are expectations there. And again, if people are turning up in a small group or as individuals and they're not part of that community, there will be tensions, and people will always get things wrong. I think if you've got a group where people are used to one another and there's enough regular faces, and it's the same for Megagamemakers and some of the more established groups in the UK especially, then people generally can resolve those because you've got through that phase. But I think particularly when it's in the early days, but I suppose I would question necessarily why people are necessarily turning up to something like Egon's Quest to learn something in particular rather than to enjoy being in that world, like lots of role play. So again, it's what's the intention from the game. So yes, it does happen, and I think being an effective control team takes time, and you need more people, and more people need to do it to understand how demanding and challenging it is. But at the same time, I think we should be doing what we can to make it easier to be control. Hence, mechanical roles in Very British Civil War for the new control team. More experienced control had the roles to do with politics, because then there was that continuum. So it's not, because otherwise, if we make being a facilitator of control almost a godlike figure in itself, and they are the law, then it's really difficult for people to live up to, and it puts people off doing it. So I think we do need to create those communities, accept people make mistakes and forgive them, and just be a bit more tolerant maybe. But yes.
Well, I'm glad that you're forgiving, because I made the mistake on this slide, because from what I had done independently before I met you, I hadn't realized you'd created a company as opposed to you were an advanced hobby group. So I talk about your company here, and I'll let you do the real talking, because you know the on the ground truth.
Well, I've read a lot of feedback forums. I've been to a lot of games. I don't know everything, obviously. But like you say, because the use of social media, which can be a double-edged sword at times, I think on the one hand, we are in a golden time, the sense that I can order, just with a PDF file, decks of education cards for, what, £20 delivered? £15 if I order several copies of them. I can order custom playing cards, dirt cheap. The banners are available. We're able to make videos for YouTube to explain how there's lots and lots of benefits. We can share the after action reports. On the other side, it does mean there are certain, if there are errors, one of my first games is Control. I made a ruling because there'd been a confusion. I went, this is the way it is. And someone else had reported it differently. And that went on for a while. And I just had to apologize to someone afterwards and say, I was wrong to overrule you. I should have just rolled with it. And that was my error. But so, yes, there's lots of benefits right now. But again, the social media can also be one of those things where you're more conscious of games that maybe you would have run 20, 30 years ago, or there's certain elements that are going to be controversial, that either you don't run a game, or, and this is, again, contributes, I think, to some of the fewer historical games, is you dress up a historical scenario that might be less palatable for lots of players as fantasy or sci-fi, as lots of authors and film directors have anyway, and you dress it up in that setting, and people don't mind playing it then, because it's not quite as contentious. So it is really good that we can do so much so easily, but at the same time, the more we produce high standard quality components, values, videos, all those things, it does raise the bar. And I think there's room for lots of games that are If it's a small group of people quite happy playing their game with writing things on a piece of paper, that's fine too, because as long as those expectations are managed and people are aware of it, I say the more the merrier. But yes, Penai Megagames, 2015 we started with Sengoku, and then we've run more than 20 games since. Obviously the pandemic hit us hard, but we did start with running Hot by Patrick Rose as our first online game, which he ran through Discord. He's ran it through 3 or 4 times now, which is pre-cyberpunky. But there's a really broad mixture of games there. I did put some pictures on the next slide.
So the other question I have is, how close to a full-time business is this, and how big is your team?
So at the minute, I'm actually mobilized with the army. So I'm full-time with them. Everything I'm having to do is in the margins. I do need to come back to this. I was hoping to go full-time until the pandemic hit. I had a couple of commercial contracts that I'd found just after I commissioned. Sadly, because of the businesses and the industry they were in, that's probably going to have to go on hold for another 12 months, I would say, until I've finished this mobilization and worked at some of the tasks. But it would probably be, I could probably do with 1 or 2 people to work with producing components and design side of things. And then we've got a rotating pool of people that I know, who I've worked with, who I would use as independent facilitators as and when we need them. Because I design the games for schools for one person to run it. Sometimes it's me, sometimes somebody else can deliver it for me, if necessary.
So in essence, you're the core. So yes. In essence, you're the core, and you've got a group of volunteers that will help you with public fun games, and you've got people that you can draw on and employ when you're doing a professional event.
So I will draw a distinction between, so if it's Penai Megagames, then Penai Megagames is that community group, and people will work for one another on a voluntary basis. I've put quite a few games on there as part of the Penai package, but also there are other games up there. So top right on the slide there, you can see that was the French invasion of Ireland. Bottom right was a shot heard around the universe, sci-fi. Top middle was the Mexican Revolution. Somebody's been given some Haribo jelly babies, I think. Top left was chariot racing in the Hippodrome, with people decorating Constantinople in blue and green glitter. And then bottom left is my brother's Megamunda game, where he built physically 25 tower blocks out of wood and labelled them all. So that's all through voluntary work. If somebody's going to do something for Story Living Games, it's a commercial thing, then I would pay them as an independent consultant for their time on the day. Just to draw attention, I think, and this is what we've been working quite hard on in the UK, I think, is looking at some of the venues we use for games. So church halls are all well and good up to a certain size. They tend to be quite cheap, or village halls. But some games you need a bit more space. So the picture there, that was from the Cold War Gone Hot game. We had 80 players on the day, I think, and that was at Endcliffe Hall. So we found that venue because my friend, his wife is the commanding officer there, and he said to me, well, he said, compared to Santos, it's not quite at Santos levels. Outside it looks great. Inside, yes, we walk past some officers, and then there's a 19th century general's uniform in a glass cabinet. There are standards on the wall. There are regimental paintings in there. So when you've got a venue like that to take your photos, and you're playing military games, particularly for those people who aren't into military games initially, that really sets the scene for them, and they enjoy the fact that they can play the different layers. And that's how we've managed to move people over who might not have played a military game initially because, well, do I have to learn about armor penetration tables or this? Actually, no, you don't. You're going to be the liaison officer between them and them to start with, and all you need to do is do as you're told and go and ask these questions. There's no mechanics for you to worry about. Just enjoy the atmosphere. So Penai Megagames is very much a community group, and I'm not the chair anymore. So that's Ken Hay this year. So and last year was Becky. So I did found the group, but also I've done a lot of mega games for the hobby, and it is quite draining. So I did want to take a bit of a breather and focus on my own stuff. And then COVID hit, and then the army said, "Can you do some change management work?" So I've been doing that for 15 months.
Yeah, in that ways, there's some similarities with our group because we've had a few individuals that have done professional engagements or support, but for the most part, it's all volunteers. And when we do the conventions and the academic venues, it's all volunteers. So just so we're all clear on that. So it's not like we're selling a product, just for the record. So Megagame Sampler, here's some other designs that I've seen come across. Obviously, Kiwi Games design is probably New Zealand. And of course, one of the other examples I've got is from Australia, I'll talk about in a minute. Dragon Thrones Sickle was actually made by Peter, and Peter's one of the folks that came and spent quite a bit of time with us and I've had regular contact with. And I would like to claim his success, but I don't think I can do that. He's done a very nice job. Watch the Skies. We've sort of talked around, and I want to hit this for a minute just so everybody has the same baseline. Watch the Skies is one of a handful of professionally published and distributed designs as opposed to something that's free. And this is very nice because it's got all the maps that you would use, all the counters, all the bits and pieces. And it's not inexpensive because it's got a lot of components. And if you buy it in the States, you've got to deal with all the issues of shipping and customs and so on. But essentially, this is a mega game in a box. And that's a wonderful thing because it gives people all of the pieces except the staff. So then you're dealing with just the quality of the staff, not your components, and trying to learn how to print to play and all the other stuff. And it's a wonderful thing. And that's another reason for its popularity in North America. Den of Wolves is another example that I wanted to be sure I hit. This is actually an example that was run up at a convention in Michigan. And you can see how it's a nice Battlestar Galactica ripoff with the picture of the spaceship Aegeus, as they call it in that game. And each one of those tables is essentially a ship with its crew. And in that game, you have a captain, a first officer. If you're big enough, you have a medical bay, a whole bunch of other elements to that. But essentially, it covers, for the most part, the same silo decision-making, limited choice groups, but then there's some special components. And in this game, there are actual characters that you can play that can get hurt and have to go to sick bay. And this is where I apparently got my slides mixed up. These are the components for Watch the Skies. All of this stuff is included as separate handouts or components. And that's important to see how thorough it is and professional it is, because mega games run by people with professional standards look as good as a professional DoD or a professional military game in any of the nations I've seen so far. And maybe there's exceptions, but this is really quality work, and it's important to understand it. Now, the amateurs have started to do a lot of other stuff. This is how they've done some shifts. This was a game that was played at Gen Con, I believe, 2 years ago. And you see how they've adapted the hex system where they have print and play kinds of hexes, and they've got towers and components where they write missions. And this is a whole bunch of people that are playing factions in a medieval city, medieval fantasy city, trying to take over. This is Melbourne Megagamers, which is a fairly small group from my understanding, and I've actually talked to a few of them and got interviewed for one of their podcasts, and they did For the Crown, which is a fictional 18th century, land that they were going to deal with the downfall of the monarchy. And it's really inventive because in each of these cases, one of the things that the mega game format allows to unleash is individual creativity with a simple set of concepts that can be turned into mechanics and components with a wide variety of aspects. This is Sickle. This is Peter's game that he designed with permission from the guys that did the board game Sickle that you'll find on Board Game Geek. There's some things that were done at, I can't remember the acronym, but our Canadian brothers, the convention in Vancouver, Sucks, I guess it is. That's probably not the right way to pronounce it. Deep Haven is another game which uses dwarves. But again, it has there's categories of players: miners, shapers, architects, merchants, and so on. This is one I found really interesting, and I've talked to at least one person that played it, which is a game called Undeniable Victory about the Iraq-Iran war. And what's interesting here is they're dealing with articles of supply and how much things break in the field and what their financial condition is. And this was basically to give them real-time problem-solving issues that were similar to the strategic situation in that war. And you can see here are some other pieces of it. This is what they say they intended to do. And that's very professional in its approach. And I want you to understand that, whether you agree with the hypothesis that they've come up with for why things work, what we're seeing here is how the hobby has moved to home crafting and home production and manufacturing, to now some people are building corporate groups to take it to the next level. So this is a prime recruiting ground for the professionals. I can't stress that enough. And that's why we wanted to ensure that we talked about this at Connections Online.
So can I just add there? So Ben Moore's is Megagamemakers, but I don't know whether he traveled over to run the game for Lessons Learned, or whether he sent the pack over for them. It was first on the Megagamemakers calendar because he works in the UK. And Battlestar, not Battlestar Galactica, sorry, Den of Wolves, John Mize on Southwest Megagames, that is available from John, and the groups in the US and Canada have been sort of buying the game and then adding their own spin on it. But John did design it as a very control-light game, similar to my games in the schools in particular, but also some of the other things I've done, where you don't need many control to run a game, because otherwise it's not really financially viable as an activity, unless it's a corporate activity.
Yeah, unless it's a corporate or you have a sponsor. And that's one of the experiences we have in the States. We've got people strewn all over the country because strange quirks attract. There are very few of our staff that live in the same cities. So if you want to do an academic event with travel and meals and lodging, it could be $5,000 for a university to have you come in for 3 days. And if they have their own housing, that helps. And we aren't asking for salaries, and that helps. But it's still expensive to have a properly trained control team available to run an event. So what does this all show? This is the point of why we wanted to do this here at Connections. It's that game designers from non-traditional wargaming backgrounds have built into a new niche. And I really tend to think, and please correct me, Paul, if you think it's differently, but these were hobbyists and amateur historians when they started in the UK, and they've gotten more and more sophisticated and more profound knowledge about how mechanics work and how to manage games with limited staff, that it's built to the next level. It's also been enhanced by the growth of wargaming and board gaming, because essentially all of these young people are already pre-primed to come into the business. And that intersection of role-playing games and military simulations is really an option for the future in professional use. They look and act like professionals, they set goals, they consider their design, they market their goods, they document play, they do AARs. That's what we do. It's part of our thing. And they run analytics on players. They run more events than many operations that do it professionally. When you look at it in aggregate, and even some groups do more. For example, I went to the War Game Certificate class, and we're an unusual group in NSDM. I know. We've been around for 30 years. I'm the new kid. I'm 20 years into it, okay? So I'm sitting there in these classes, and we have military guys that are just starting their first tour related to the work. We have contractors who've been doing the work. We have military people who've been around for 15 or 20 years, and they say, how many games have you run, to the guy who works for unnamed government agency? And he says, I've been doing this for 7 years, and I've run 5. And then the next person says, well, I've run 10. And they say, Merle, how many have you run? Oh, 500. That's the thing that happens when it's the passion that's driving you. And that's what's going on with these youngsters that we're seeing playing the mega games, whether they're high school students or college students or just hobbyists. They set real goals for what they wanted to do in 2020 before COVID hit as a group on their Facebook pages. And this is a coalition of somewhere in the neighborhood of 20, maybe even 30 groups of people that are running mega games in North America. That's what I think is really useful, because you're starting to see the skill level improve dramatically. So the real issue from a professional simulators thing is they're playing mostly iconic and fantasy stuff versus things that we would call fidelity to reality. but the potential applications are just absolutely astonishing. And the ideas are well worth stealing. And as Paul and I both mentioned, you want to steal from the best and then steal from the rest. So, you know, the lessons that we learn out of it, in my view, is, you know, there's an improved quality of resources for both design and production. You could hire some of these youngsters as supplemental to your team, even though your core staff might have to have professional credentials of some kind. And they help you do things through social media. So if you want us to use social media to help run a non-classified game or event, that's important. And they also have PR approaches in terms of how they do their glitz and their advertising and their promotion that we can learn from. And it has alternative uses of techniques we all know about. So, I mean, it really has some wonderful features. Yes, Paul.
So I was just going to say, when you talked about being able to hire people, I know that sometimes there's a tension. One of the expectations is around Watch the Skies is the most known mega game in the world. Has been played on every continent, bar Antarctica maybe. But if people have played that and that's their expectation, how do you manage that when they turn up to another game? So we had some people who wanted to play Not Over by Christmas in Sheffield because they'd played Watch the Skies. And their email actually said to me, so we want to know what the chances of us being able to play the Czechs and get our hands on some nuclear weapons and go rogue. And I emailed back and said, thank you very much for your inquiry. In this particular case, this game, it's in the designer's notes, but there is a chain of command. That would not happen in those circumstances. However, we have got a Pirates game coming up in a couple months after that. You might enjoy the Pirate Republic game far more. And it was about steering them and then getting them in the group, and then you can have that conversation. But I think the other one around the expectations is the cost of mega games. And we talked about the fact that people travelling for overnight, public transport costs, £30 a head is very cheap for a full day's entertainment, really, but still quite a lot for lots of people who are younger. And I think and every so often there are debates around people running games professionally, or wanting to be charged for, or putting your server together. And Dave Boundy, I'm going to give him a shout out now, has been working really hard on systems using, he started with Gather Town, but other systems to play online games. So I'm not going to say any more. I'll let Dave answer any questions in the Discord chat. He's done sterling work there. I know some guys in the States were looking at creating one. It's their day job, so they'd wanted. And I think there can be a tension at times between older, and this is war gamers full stop, war gamers, mega gamers, anyone who have worked in the public sector or who've had steady, regular jobs with pensions and all the rest of that, and maybe had housing at a good time, or was able to buy a house at a good time, and younger professionals or who've just graduated or maybe still at university, who are still developing their career in a far more uncertain job market and cannot afford the same amount of time for free, voluntarily. And I think, and sometimes I'm not always conscious of it, I'm a little bit older myself, but I think it is something we need to bear in mind. There's a limit to how much you can do on goodwill, and to take things to the next level, there does need to, particularly when in other areas people will spend thousands on a murder mystery or something like that for their staff team building activity, or they'll send them all canoeing for the afternoon and spend thousands. So I've been asked by someone to do some work with some apprentices, and post-COVID we're hoping to focus on that again. But
yes.
They would.
And a good related part of this is this question, because essentially what you're pointing out is, you have to be careful in the vetting process. There are people all along the spectrum of capability. And what this basically does, in my view, is mega games run at conventions and academic venues have a couple of advantages. One is they don't have to travel unless they already plan to be there. Okay, so it's a built-in audience physically. And the other aspect of that is, these are people who are more familiar with distributed gaming tools than most of our professionals. So when the question comes up like this is, could the younger generation effectively socialize already, effectively online run a mega game? I can tell you they already have. And there's some of them that are just as sophisticated as the things, I shouldn't be showing that I'm going to be back. that are just as sophisticated as any of the professionals that we deal with. The thing is, the only way you find out is by observing their behavior and seeing what they talk about in their dialogue on the social groups that they have, Megagame Assembly, Coalition, and so on, because that's where you see the thoughtful ones. And, you know, if 1 out of 100 in a community of 2,800 people played games like this in 2019 was my best estimate, okay, from taking the number of games and doing some quick math, you know, back of the envelope math. You know, if 1 in 100, there's 28 people out there that are going to be great facilitators that you could apprentice, or they could build components for you once you explain it, or they could help you write up the narratives based on some simple guidelines. So you have a force multiplier. The other part of it is they already have the bug. They have the I love wargaming infection. And really, you know, one of the things I learned being a Lean Six Sigma black belt and before is basically, what do you do when you want help? You go and you look for the people who are angry or the people who are excited. Because if they're angry, they'll go, this just is not fitting. It's got to change. And it doesn't matter if their boss tells them not to. They will work for you. You won't get 100%, but you will get consistent work until that thing is fixed. If they're excited and say, that's way cool, you got them hooked, because they're going to help you at some level from their own personal commitment, their own personal time to do anything you want to try to accomplish. You just have to realize it's targeted. You find the thing that they're enthusiastic about, they work. If you start trying to task them rather than partner with them, you're not going to be successful. But find the angry ones and the excited ones, and you'll have all the volunteers that you need.
I was just going to say, actually, when you were talking earlier, but the question around individual players and distributing it, it's been done with Megagames. For those people who were in on the integrity chats, integrity, I've got a board behind me on the wall. You can just about see there. I'll quite happy to answer any questions on the Discord. But that was designed as a tabletop exercise for the military to look at outreach/civil affairs issues, particularly focused around corruption. It looks a little bit like a mega game when people are standing around in different groups around tables, but it is very much around teaching specific lessons. But then when COVID hit, and we've taken it out as a recruitment tool, we've run it with an NGO so they could see how the military would approach and measure their progress. But when the pandemic hit, we were like, oh, well, I'll tell you what, I was going to tour around the north of England with someone, teach them how to do it and train a trainer. Then we decided to try running it online for a conference. We next ran it with our University Officer Training Corps at Oxford University. And the day before the game, they were having a briefing when they were told that the platoon commanders were facilitating the individual rooms, playing most of the game. I only found out 15 minutes before them that that was how it was going to be run. So I said, right, overnight, lots of reassurance. Overnight, I rewrote the game. We then ran it the next day, and I'd said to them, look, you have my absolute license. If you've done Dungeons & Dragons, if you've done any other role-playing, if you just want to say, I know how this game works, I just want to facilitate it my way, that's fine. If you want to follow the rules as written, that's fine too. The main thing is that you enjoy it and you're seen in your role as a platoon commander to go through these steps. Then we did it with a field hospital before Easter, and apart from one person who needed a lot of support, but then did get on board, people were really excited by it. And the good thing is, every time we've run it online, there's been a follow-up request to go back in and play the full game with all the nuances and extra roles in person as soon as they're able to, because people are excited, they're engaged, and they had agency, not just as players, but in influencing the outcome of the game as facilitators. So hopefully, Connections UK, I have discussed this with their commanding officer, Oxford UOTC, will work on a games-based learning activity with me, which we can demonstrate at Connections UK. So anyone who's coming, because it's online, we will hopefully have something there for you to try. And that will be facilitated by university students who will have designed the game themselves. I've no idea what the topic is yet because we haven't discussed it, but several of them are interested and want to, right from that early stage and possibly a military career, get involved in Megagame or get involved in gaming.
So another thing I want to add at this point is I'm really actively recruiting, because being outreach director for 2 conventions, it's important. One of the things I've been thinking about, and if people are interested in participating and helping, is having a modern mega games kind of panel, either as an extended or a core event for Connections USA this summer. So I would love to take advantage of the wonderful thing that happened here at Connections, where Paul and I managed to meet online, and I managed to recruit him to come to this presentation, because originally it was going to be solo. He's added a lot of value to this, and I really appreciate that. The real value beyond that would be adding more folks in a bigger discussion. And maybe one of the things we'll try for is to get the hobbyists in a panel, and then to get professionals in a panel for this summer, if I can recruit enough folks. So if anybody's interested, put a note in the Discord and I'll follow up after the convention. So I think I've got one more slide here. Yes, new blood for the aging profession. I really can't stress this enough, because it's the enthusiasm and creativity of these folks. And a lot of them are being trained as professionals, just as we are, whether it's history, political science, military affairs, whatever you're doing professional competition and cooperation facilitation and games on, these folks are doing it. They're in the embryo stage of what you need for the next. And I can't say that enough. I want people to realize that that's a resource for the future, just like the George Washington Wargaming Society, as Georgetown University Wargaming Society is with GOOS, just like the service academies are an area that we can look at recruiting. Just like the other professional associations. I think the one is SIS that I just learned about, that's statistical simulations and modeling, but I'm probably not getting that right. But the point is, we can reach out and find new talent, and we can challenge ourselves with that new talent to look at our assumptions and what we're doing. So we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I want to check if there's any questions in chat we can answer on screen, and I'm not seeing any, but we will answer stuff on Discord as we can. And I want to thank Paul again. He's really helped the quality of what we've delivered here.
No, thank you.
Yeah, go on.
Good to meet.
Things. If you want to do a company plug.
It's been really good, actually. I was going to feedback. I was really interested in Xavier's comments around historical. It's almost world building, and when you're building that game, is what do you choose? And I think that is really important. And that was probably my biggest takeaway. Was aside all the other lessons, was this idea that be really clear with the players how you see this world working, because most of the times when there have been issues, it's because I've not communicated it to the players, and I've got that base level of understanding amongst everyone as a group. And I think, to be honest, that applies elsewhere as well. We've just had a conversation after the integrity chat around how I've got some ideas about where I want to take it next. And we're chatting with Eva about how it could be used, looking at wider stabilization issues and the continuum. So this is what's been really good, is not just the chance to share things, but also the chance to see which new dots we can start to join. Thank you.
Well, thanks again to everybody. As I said, we'll answer questions in the chat either right after or downrange. And we hope to see you all at Connections USA in June. Registration will be up for that in the next couple of weeks, because they're going to take the lessons we learned here to figure out how they're going to deliver that this summer. So thanks again, and we're going to sign off.